Good evening. We're back in the book of Lamentations. I know this is a very long book and the chapters are pretty long, and next week chapter is going to be pretty long too. That chapter has 66 verses. I would like for you guys to be able to read through them, but don't put too much pressure on yourself. If you can't get through the whole chapter, it's okay. My goal is to kind of expose you to the chapter, and then we can talk more about it as we go on Zoom and as we make these videos together. So we're in chapter 2, where we're seeing some more darkness, and we're seeing how God's people is responding to God's presence being removed from them. So in this chapter, we're seeing God removing himself from his people and how it affects his people. It is very dark in their sadness. So we're going to see what that life without God and his presence looks like in this chapter. So it starts in verse 1, where it says, how long, Lord, or how the Lord has covered daughter Zion with the cloud of his anger. So we see this cloud imagery to begin this chapter. He has hurled down the splendor of Israel from heaven to earth. Hurled down the splendor of Israel from heaven to earth. The first thing I thought about was Satan, and how Satan was hurled from heaven, dwelling with God, to earth, and now God's people. So this is how we start the chapter, just on this darkness. But before I get more into the chapter, let me ask you this question, and think about this for a second. What would happen if your parents just disappeared one day? Like, you're at home more often now because of this whole corona thing. But just imagine what would happen if your parents just disappeared. How are you going to eat? Who's going to wash the dishes? Who's going to do the laundry? Who's going to bring in money? It's going to affect your life in a lot of different ways. Some of you guys are old enough to work, so some of you guys would work, but others are not old enough to take care of themselves. So depending on who you are, you can be affected in different ways. And we see this happening. So God has been removed from the lives of his people. And this is what we're dealing with. Okay, look at verse 3. He has withdrawn his right hand at the approach of the enemy. So life without God, we're seeing, is wrath. So the enemy was knocking on the door, and at first God was protecting his people, but now he removed his hand. So now the enemy is coming in and doing damage. And we're seeing this. Look at verse 5. Verse 5 has the nerve to say that the Lord is like an enemy. Wow, he has swallowed up Israel. He has swallowed up all her palaces and destroyed her strongholds. He has multiplied mourning and lamentation for daughter Judah. And if you remember lamentation, that this is a loud wailing, a loud expression of an inward reality, just sorrows upon sorrow. This is what's happening. So in the first 10 verses, we're saying that life without God is wrath. And then we see some grief. In verses 11 through 19, we're seeing that life without God is grief. Look at verse 11. My eyes fail from weeping. I am in torment within. My heart is poured out on the ground because my people are destroyed, because children and infants faint in the streets of the city. So there's sorrow, there's grief, and there's loss. And we see this all throughout this section. And the thing is, this could have been avoided. Look at verse 14. The vision of your prophets were false and worthless. They did not expose your sin to ward off your captivity. The prophecies they gave you were false and misleading. So if your leaders were more effective in their preaching and in their profiting, they could have avoided this. They could have helped you avoid this, but because they didn't expose your sin, and because of your sins, you're having to pay the penalty. And lastly, we're seeing that life without God is hopeless. Look at verses 20 through 22, the ending of this chapter. Look, Lord, and consider, whom have you ever treated like this? Should women eat their offspring? It's so bad and so hopeless that women are eating their kids right now. This is a desperate situation. The children they have cared for, should priest and prophet be killed in the sanctuary of the Lord? Young and old lie together in the dust of the streets. My young man and young woman have fallen by the sword. You have slain them in the day of your anger. You have slaughtered them without pity. As you summon to a feast day, so you summon against me terrors on every side. In the day of the Lord's anger, no one escaped or survived. Those I cared for and reared, my enemy has destroyed. So there is hopeless here. And I think the most vivid picture of hopelessness is in the last verse, where Jerusalem is mourning for a lost child or lost children. Guys, children were so important. Kids were so important at this time. Kids were how the name was brought forward. The name of a family was brought forward. The kids were how people retired back then. So kids were the hope for the future of God's people. And now kids have been taken away from them. So they are just hopeless right now. And it's a very dark situation. So this is what life without God looks like. And I know it's very dark, and there may not be like anything that we can maybe directly apply, but I think there's some things that we can learn. First off, we can learn that life without God and his presence is very dark. We see that here. This is a picture of it. We see the importance of God and his presence. Secondly, we're seeing that God is the sustainer. God is the sustainer of our lives, and without him, we don't have provisions. We don't have what we need to survive. And lastly, not everything is good that is happening, but everything is redeemable, excuse me. Everything is redeemable. So one question I want you to think about as we're closing is, what would your life without God look like? Think about that for a second. Take some time to thank God for his presence. Even in the midst of this craziness in our country, we still have God in his presence. He is still working. But think about that question as we end. And we can talk more about this later this evening on Zoom. See you at 7:30.